Professor and preacher Tom Long remembers when he was a new pastor, a young man at a small church, and he announced to the congregation, next Sunday morning, I'm going to start a pastor's class, kind of like the one we started this morning, about the basics of the Christian faith. So if you're new to the faith or you want a refresher, he invited people, join me next Sunday at 10. And I invite you to join me next Sunday at 9:30, just saying. Well, the next week, he went into his classroom ready to greet the throngs of people who would come, only to find 3 elementary school children, 3 little girls who were waiting for him. Thank goodness I had a little bit bigger crowd than that. Anyway, he admits he was disappointed, but for the next few weeks, he did his best to teach them. And one week, he asked these girls if they knew what Pentecost was. They didn't, so he told them. Pentecost, he said, was when the church was gathered and there was a great rush of wind and tongues of fire came down from heaven above their heads, and they spoke in all of the different languages of the world. And the church grew by 3,000 people, and they went out and they shared the good news and did the work of Jesus in the world. And one of the little girls was just awestruck. Her eyes were as big as saucers, and she said, "Pastor Long, when was this? I think my family and I were absent that Sunday." You may be thinking that I am as adorably confused, or at least as confused as that little girl, but no, I realize that today is not Pentecost Sunday. We celebrated that way back at the end of May. And yet this is a story worth returning to, especially on this anniversary of our church's birth, 71 years ago this week, because it is the story of the church's birth 2,000 years ago, how the disciples had gathered together when a wind swept through the house and the flames showed up, and these farmers and fishermen from Galilee began speaking in different languages. The hubbub caught people's attention and drew a crowd, and they each heard someone speaking in their native tongue. Parthians in Parthian, Cappadocians in Cappadocian, Medes in Median? That's math. Medish? I don't know. Anyway, people were amazed. And Peter stands up and says, this is what God has promised, that God's Spirit would be poured out on all people. And he launches into this spontaneous sermon on Jesus' life and death and resurrection, and 3,000 people accept Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior and walk the aisle and are baptized and are added to the church's membership roll, and they worship and they fellowship and they serve and they grow. Man, what a day it was. Emphasis on was. Because now we tend to look back on this story of the church's birthday the way we watch kids at a birthday party, running around, having fun, squealing with joy. It's so cute. But now I just as soon eat my cake, go home, and take a nap. All that excitement and activity, the wind and the fire of Pentecost, there may have been a time for all that, but not anymore. And so we celebrate the blessed backdraft of Pentecost on one Sunday a year, Pentecost Sunday, and then we forget about it. But I think that we need to remember and reclaim this story of the church's birth and our birthright of God's Spirit. The primary symbol of the Spirit, at least on Pentecost, is fire, flames, which makes sense since fire is a source of energy. And the story of that day in Scripture gives us a beautiful picture of an energized community, figuratively, and I guess as it goes literally, on fire with God's Spirit. The only problem is the vigor and the vitality of that day, the boldness, the creativity, the community, the Spirit-driven mission and purpose has too often become a light switch we flip on and off instead of a fire that burns continuously within us. And maybe that's because we know how dangerous fire can be. Author Annie Dillard wonders if we Christians have any clue about the power of God's Spirit that we so casually speak of and invoke. She says churches are like children playing with chemistry sets on the floor, mixing up a batch of TNT. So yeah, there is a risk. It is dangerous if we let the fire of Pentecost burn within us, if we let God's Spirit guide and shape and lead us, because who knows where we will end up, or what we will end up doing, or who we will end up becoming. But then again, who would we be if we don't? See, that's what makes that story of the little girl in the pastor's class so beautiful. Not that she misunderstood Pentecost, but that she understood, maybe more than most of us, the real power of God's Spirit. Because she believed it could have happened in her little church. That God's Spirit could have been poured out upon them, that they could have been transformed and reborn, renewed, walking more fully and faithfully in the way of Jesus, sharing the good news and doing God's work in the world, that they could have come alive with the fire of God's Spirit. Which, why couldn't they be? God's Spirit brings life. And come to think of it, fire does too. We typically think of fire as a destructive force. We've certainly seen that play out. We've seen the dangers of wildfires resulting from years of a changing climate, drier weather. But periodic controlled fires are actually helpful to the ecosystem. They return carbon and nutrients to the soil. They clear space for new growth. Some plants actually need fire for their seeds to germinate, or at the very least, they have adapted so that their roots stay alive underground during a fire and they regrow stronger and healthier the next year. Or, for our next lesson in our middle school earth science class, take plate tectonics, for instance. How the Earth's crust is made up of these massive plates that actually move and float on the molten rock below. Those upper layers of the Earth's crust, on the surface, they are rigid, so when they meet, when they move, they break and they crack. They cause earthquakes and tsunamis and devastating, violent volcanic eruptions. But underneath, even the rocks themselves are transformed by the fiery heat. They become molten and movable, able to flow. What's more, as these plates separate and crack and move over and under one another, magmas form at deep levels and are brought up to the surface and bring with them nutrients, even water, the very essence of life. As people of faith, as a community of faith, we need that same kind of fluidity that comes with the renewing, transforming fire of God's Spirit if we are to have life. That's why it's important for us to remember and return to these origin stories of the church, born of wind and flame again and again and again, to allow it to revive and renew us again and again and again, to remind us of the kind of church we are called to be, not just one Sunday a year, but again and again and again. Kind of like an actual fire. Now, I am no Boy Scout, so when we got a fire pit for our backyard, I had to Google videos of the best ways to start a fire and keep it going. And for starters, you do have to set it up the right way to even get it going. But once it is ablaze, no matter how big it is, no matter how intense the flames, if you don't do anything else, eventually the fire will die. To keep it burning, you have to tend it. You have to turn over some logs and move some things around, rearrange and adjust to the changing conditions. You'll have to add new fuel as well, new elements to keep it lit. Once it's used up all that it had, it will need new resources to keep it burning. You have to clear out the dead coals and the ashes of what has been used up. What was giving energy to the flames before can actually end up stifling and suffocating them later on. You have to let it breathe. You have to allow for the air, for the wind to move through it, which, interestingly enough, is the other symbol for God's Spirit. So now, armed with my YouTube knowledge and a set of long metal tongs, I am constantly fiddling with our backyard fires. My wife Susie says I can't leave well enough alone, that I am obsessed and kind of a pyromaniac. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just Pentecostal. Because like any fire, our personal faith and our community of faith must be tended. It must be stoked, or we might say, renewed. Because periodically we have to turn things over and move things around, to rearrange and restructure, to evolve with changing conditions. We may have to acknowledge that what was once giving us life might not be anymore. And that's okay. We must create room for God's Spirit to move through us and breathe life into us in new ways. And when that happens, we have to put our resources where God's Spirit is moving to fuel those flames and keep the fire alive, to keep it moving and flowing as we move towards God's purposes and promises for us. Friends, that's Pentecost. Not just in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago or celebrated once a year in churches, but whenever we allow God's Spirit to burn within us and breathe new life into us. And I thank God that Augusta Heights is a Pentecost people, open to how the Spirit of God is forming us, inspiring us, empowering us, renewing us. When a handful of folks sense God's Spirit calling them to start a church, to minister to the people who lived all the way down on that end of Augusta Street, on that end of town, they officially formed Augusta Heights Baptist Church 71 years ago this week. When this community of faith gathered, they did so wherever they could, in homes, in a school cafeteria at Blythe, in a dairy across the street, so they could devote themselves to teaching and fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. And then, instead of moving, as many in the neighborhood did when white flight of the 1960s happened because of the racist practices of things like blockbusting, well, this church stayed, open to new people, to new possibilities, to new ministries. That same Spirit moved when the pastor married divorcees in the 60s, or the church called women deacons in the 70s, or the church set up a counseling center to address mental health needs in the 80s, or started an AIDS care ministry in the 90s, or created affordable housing on the former parsonage property in the 2000s, or became a fully inclusive, affirming church in the 2010s. In every decade, at every step along the way, the journey of Augusta Heights, our journey, has been guided by God's Spirit. Our history is one of perpetual Pentecost as our church and our calling are continually reimagined, reinvigorated, reborn, renewed. And I pray that today we are ready for renewal again. Ready to allow God's Spirit to burn within us and breathe through us, to live into the purposes and the promises of God, to reclaim our calling as God's people, to go out, to share the good news, to do the work of Jesus in the world. In short, by the power of God's Spirit, to come alive. And so much so that when a child asks us about Pentecost, how God's Spirit moves in and among and through the followers of Jesus, and ask, when was this? That we can say, today.
As we look down the road where all the prodigals have walked, one by one the enemy has whispered lies and led them off as slaves. But we know that you are God, yours is the victory. We know there is more to come that we may not yet see. So with the faith you've given us, we'll step into the valley of the afraid. Yeah. We call out to dry bones, come alive, come alive. We call out to dead hearts, come alive, come alive. Up out of the ashes, let us see an army rise. We call out to dry bones, come alive. God of endless mercy, God of unrelenting love, rescue every doubt and bring us back the way we're